Hello and welcome to Energy Transition Talk, the podcast that explores the challenges and opportunities of transitioning to a low-carbon future. I'm Paulina.
I'm Justine.
And I'm Jim.
And we are your hosts for the Energy Transition Talk.
In this podcast, we seek to break down some of the most complex and important issues regarding the energy transition and how it impacts us. In each episode, we tell a story by bringing you various perspectives about the energy transition so that you can make the best and most informed decisions for you and your communities.
A lot of the talk around renewable energy seems to be focused on wind and solar, but there are other renewable sources that might be worth paying attention to as well. In our last episode, we talked about geothermal. In this episode, we discussed the potential for hydrogen to be another tool in the energy transition. Hydrogen's been around for a while as an energy source, but it's experiencing a kind of a revival with technology able to convert hydrogen from different inputs, water, methane, or even geologic hydrogen.
Yes, Jim, and it's also getting some attention from government investment. The Biden administration announced in October 2023 that it will award up to $7 billion to fund 7 regional hydrogen hubs across the U.S. In order to spur the production of hydrogen as a clean energy source. These regional hubs that are called H2 hubs aim to kickstart a national network of clean hydrogen producers, consumers of infrastructure, and thereby jumpstarting the emerging industry. So in this episode, I will first speak with a student and fuel cell researcher at USC, Yeshvi Tomar, who will explain the basics of hydrogen as a source of energy and its benefits and limitations.
We then speak with Dr. Justine and Economides, a professor at the University of Houston, who dives a little deeper into what the different colors of hydrogen mean, how hydrogen can be used, and the potential to scale up the role of hydrogen as an energy source.
So to set the stage, here's our conversation with Yeshvi. Yeshvi Tomar is a graduate student that works on fuel cell technology, interested in energy systems and the role of hydrogen in the energy transition. She has a master's from the IIT Bombay and a bachelor's degree from the University of Delhi, both in chemistry. She has published a paper on the synthesis and characterization of CUS thin films for glucose sensing. Welcome, Yeshvi, to the Energy Transition Talk. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Paulina, for having me here. And I really feel grateful that I have been given this opportunity to be part of these conversations. So yeah, thank you.
Maybe just going back to basics, and I understand that your focus is hydrogen. So for those of us that might not be as well versed as you, could you maybe explain the basics of hydrogen as an energy source and how it works, maybe compare it to other sources such as natural gas, of how it releases, of how it's produced, and how it's renewable?
Okay, so hydrogen economy, it's a very simple idea. You take hydrogen, one of the plentiful element on the planet Earth. It is present in the form of water and hydrocarbons. You extract the hydrogen from these elements and then use it as an energy source for running cars, warming houses, or generating electricity. So that's the simple idea with hydrogen economy. And the biggest advantage of hydrogen is that it is a cleaner source. The byproduct with hydrogen you get is water, which is not the case with fossil fuels. It's a heavily carbon generating source. The interesting thing is that 60% of our oil goes into transportation related areas. So there have been a lot of developments and programs being launched that are heavily supporting hydrogen based technologies. And at the moment, we need to, despite all these advantages with hydrogen, we have disadvantages of it. We have challenges along our journey of using hydrogen as a fuel, right from its production. Currently the way we are generating hydrogen, it is 95% from methanol steam from steam reforming, and it basically is using fossil fuel to generate hydrogen. So that defeats the purpose of a clean source, because we are in the process of generating hydrogen, leading to carbon emission. We do have more mature technology like water electrolysis that produces clean source of hydrogen, but then at the same time it is a very expensive project if you want to generate hydrogen from electrolysis. So the thing that we need to take care of is cut down the cost with the water electrolysis, so that we can shift our hydrogen generation methods from steam reforming to more sustainable and cleaner hydrogen production sources like water electrolysis, or we can also generate hydrogen from other clean sources like nuclear energy, wind energy, biomass, and so on.
So has hydrogen been used before, or where did we learn that we could use hydrogen as an alternative source of energy, and maybe where it's more commonly used if it's been used before?
Yeah, so interestingly, hydrogen have been used in early 19th century as an energy source. It was used to run warm houses, used in industries and businesses. It was used under the name of town gas, which was actually a mixture of 60% hydrogen with carbon monoxide. But with the discovery of oil, people moved to oil, using oil more as an energy source, because at that time town gas had carbon monoxide, which was poisonous to humans. And usage of oil began to rise until 1970s oil crisis hit, and that was the time where people started shifting their interest back to hydrogen, and the hydrogen economy term was introduced. And the interest in hydrogen remained as long as the prices for oil were high. And it was until 1980s where again oil became inexpensive and people started using oil heavily, to the extent that for US it cut its renewable energy budget by 80% in 1980s. So when we move further into 1990s, it was the time where all the scientific communities were coming up with their data that proves that fossil fuel is not an inexhaustible resource, and it leads to carbon emission that causes global warming and climate change. So that was the time in 1990s where people became aware about the repercussions of using fossil fuels, and they were getting serious of finding other alternatives, and hydrogen came as the right choice at that time.
That is fascinating. And thank you for sharing, that, Yashvi.
Yeah.
And we're also very curious to learn more about your research on fuel cells. And first, could you maybe explain to us maybe how fuel cells exactly work and what it does, and maybe have fuel cells evolved over time, or maybe some of the challenges and opportunities that you've seen in your work and in the field?
Okay, so fuel cell, I work on direct methanol fuel cell, and I have recently transitioned to it. So currently I'm building methanol fuel cell and studying it. But the overall idea of my project is to capture the hydrogen from methanol oxidation in the fuel cell, and then use that hydrogen for hydrogen fuel cell. So now why I'm doing this whole thing of first generating hydrogen from methanol fuel cell and then using it for hydrogen fuel cell, there are two reasons for that. One is we don't have the distribution for hydrogen like gasoline. So we can use methanol as a hydrogen carrier, and we can anytime generate then hydrogen on site for various applications that uses hydrogen fuel cell. And the other reason why we want to use hydrogen fuel cell compared to direct methanol fuel cell is because hydrogen fuel cell is more efficient and more mature technology. So that's the whole idea of my project that I have been researching on.
Based on my understanding, they essentially work like batteries?
No, there's a big difference between a battery and a fuel cell. With battery you have to there are like many types of batteries. Some are primary battery that cannot be recharged. Then there are secondary batteries that are rechargeable batteries. You can charge and discharge, like lead acid batteries we have. But with fuel cells you don't have to worry about charging and discharging. As long as you have the fuel in the fuel cell, you are going to get the energy output. So that's the biggest difference with the fuel cell.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
So thinking of, if you have the energy in the fuel cell, and as long as there is hydrogen in the cell, you will be able to produce energy. What are the challenges that you find more commonly within fuel cells, and maybe what are the opportunities that you've detected?
Okay, so opportunities with the fuel cell is that it's it's um it's a clean source of energy, right? There's no carbon emissions. Then it's a very scalable technology. We have fuel cells that are used to charge mobile phones, to fuel cells that are used in space programs. Then the other advantages of fuel cell is that these are more efficient compared to internal combustion engines. A fuel cell, hydrogen fuel cell specifically, is around 70% efficient compared to the efficiency of internal combustion engine that is around 30%. So they have advantages in that sense. But then the biggest challenges that the fuel cell technology faces is that it's a fairly modern technology. It came into picture with the hydrogen economy in the 1990s, so it is still a modern technology. So it's not that efficient at the moment, and also manufacturing and maintaining these fuel cell technology, it's a very expensive business. Other than that, even if you plan to use hydrogen as a fuel, we don't have the proper infrastructure or distribution for hydrogen, so that people can easily access hydrogen. So that is why hydrogen at the moment is not popular with the masses, but we still have hydrogen based fuel cell cars that run on the road, but it is still not quite yet there as compared to the gasoline based cars we use.
And I would love to ask more about these hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and also maybe thinking of how do you transport hydrogen from the source to where you want to use it, if you're mentioning that it's hard to manage, and it's expensive to kind of to extract, to transport, and to have all these iterations of it.
Yeah, that's the challenge that needs to be overcome if we are imagining a world running on hydrogen, because hydrogen is a very light element. It can even make the steel brittle over the time. So the infrastructure that we have for current oils, we cannot use that simply. There are many ways you can transport hydrogen. You can transport it as a gas, you can liquefy it, you can pressurize it, or you can use other chemicals that can transfer hydrogen, like methanol, ethanol. You can just extract hydrogen from them on site. Then there are metal hydrides. These are like solid substances that can absorb hydrogen, and when you want to use hydrogen, you can apply pressure and temperature and extract the hydrogen out of them. So these are the various kind of distribution paths for hydrogen. And the biggest, then how do you plan to distribute it? You can plan to use like tanks for distributing hydrogen, or pipelines. And it has been found that economically, for shorter distances up to 3,000 kilometers, you can transport hydrogen through pipelines. So that's really good. US has around 26,000 kilometer of pipelines built for this purpose, and Europe stays behind a shorter. It has around 1,600 kilometer of pipelines. And the good thing is people are very much interested in shifting our energy sources. So I have recently read that Europe is aiming to build a pan Europe pipeline network for hydrogen distribution. So this is, I mean, it depends of the transportation depends upon the kind of place you want it to transport, and also on um, I mean, there are a lot of iterations of how you can transport it effectively, efficiently on from in shorter distances through waterways. So yeah, that's basically it.
That is all fascinating to hear.
Mhm.
And maybe could we go back to the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles? What do they look like? Um, how do they kind of charge, or is it similar or different from maybe the more commonly battery powered EVs? Maybe could you give us some insights around this?
Yeah, so hydrogen fuel cell based cars have been experimented since 1990s, where this hydrogen economy idea was launched. And many big companies have their hydrogen fuel cell cars, like BMW, Toyota, and many big automobile companies have their cars that run on hydrogen fuel cell. Interestingly, there is Toyota Mirai that have sold around 20,000 units of hydrogen fuel cell car in November 2022. And so these are different from EV in the sense that they are not yet very efficient compared to an EV, but there are cars that being launched which are a combination of an internal combustion engine and fuel cell. So you can use a hydrogen fuel, and if you have like if you don't have a refueling station for hydrogen, you can just switch to a gasoline based engine to run your car. So these kind of things that have been developing. And also, compared to EV, the refueling infrastructure, as I discussed before, it's still not yet there. There are still, I mean, I don't know how good the EV sector is in providing, charging stations, but what I know about hydrogen is that it is we still have we lack in providing a proper accessible hydrogen, like few other fuels or even the charging stations, as far as I know.
And based on the last question that you made, that you don't know how they are, we have an episode on that, on EVs and charging stations. So stay tuned, and more to come around that. So maybe thinking about the charging stations or refueling stations for hydrogen, do you think that this is because there is a safety issue when handling hydrogen, or is more of an infrastructure question?
I mean, both are the reasons. First and foremost is the infrastructure. We don't have the infrastructure for an efficient and economical infrastructure that could store and transfer hydrogen. And also, it has been found that hydrogen is very, flammable. So you can't just simply be. You need well-trained professionals to handle hydrogen gas. So it is. Uh, it is definitely have safety concerns, but if we have well sound technologies that could be used to store and run hydrogen, I think then that would not be an issue, because even gasoline is flammable. Every energy source has some sort of issues, drawbacks with them as well.
And maybe to kind of visualize what fuel cells and hydrogens, what they do for us, could you give us some examples of where we can see them, maybe successful applications in the US and beyond, of fuel cells and of hydrogen specifically?
So fuel cells specifically, yeah, they have bigger market in transport businesses. We have fuel cells that are used in public transports, fleet buses, passenger trains, and then individually owned cars that are running on hydrogen fuel cells. But other than that, fuel cells are used as a power backup system where we need a reliable source of electricity, like in hospitals or military installations and stuff. Then hydrogen fuel cells are, yeah, so hydrogen fuel cells, since being a very expensive technology, being it being a very expensive thing to maintain and manufacture it, so we don't quite see much applications as of now, but we hope to see more of hydrogen fuel cells in various sectors in future.
Absolutely. And what we recently found was that the Biden administration recently announced plans to award up to $7 billion to creating 7 regional hydrogen hubs around the country. So do you think that this is a plan towards making hydrogen a more competitive green energy option in the US and maybe around the world?
Yeah, I believe that this is the right step taken if we really are serious about our energy patterns, if we want to move to more cleaner sources. And having these hubs would mean, it's a whole plethora of different various things happening all together. And having these kind of things like hydrogen hub that you talked about, it would help in cutting down the cost, and yeah, definitely making it competitive with the existing fossil fuel based energy sources. But I would say still at the moment we are very far behind in competing it with the oil based energy source, because it is yet not very efficient in many on infrastructure level, or distribution level. Yeah.
So maybe having hydrogen be the underdog when we're thinking about infrastructure, when we're talking about like investments, how how big of a role do you think that hydrogen will play in the energy transition? Or why should we pay attention to hydrogen?
I would say that definitely based on its chemical properties and its abundance in the nature, hydrogen does have a potential to be considered as a fuel for the future. But it requires, a collaborative effort between governments, research institutions, industries to come up together to overcome the challenges that lies on the way of employing hydrogen economy, right? Right from its hydrogen production, its distribution, storage, and the technologies that uses hydrogen as a fuel, they have their challenges that need to be overcome. And I think the key thing that could help in this transition would be having policies and strategies that aim on incentivizing hydrogen and making it more accessible and affordable. I think that could play a key role. And other than that, the thing is, I would say, is now that people are more aware about the fossil fuel limitations, they are more open to the alternative energy sources. So I think the future is hopeful in that sense, and hydrogen definitely has the potential of doing the transition.
Absolutely, Yashvi. And before we wrap up, I wanted to ask, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience about the future of hydrogen in the energy mix, maybe to other to other students or professionals that are wanting to develop work in this field, or anything else that you would like to share with us?
I would like to tell people through this platform that, try to think about more creative ways that we can, economically make hydrogen more competitive to gasoline, and hopefully in the future we might see world running on hydrogen.
We can only hope, Yashvi, definitely.
Yeah, until we find something even better than hydrogen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us today and for this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me here, Paulina. It was nice talking to you.
Likewise, thank you so much.
Now that we have a general understanding of hydrogen, we next speak with Dr. Economides from the University of Houston and get her take on the potential of hydrogen to play a larger role in the energy transition. Here's our conversation. Dr. Economides is a professor of petroleum engineering and the Hugh Roy and Lily Krantz Cullen Distinguished University Chair at the University of Houston. She is recognized as one of the nation's most accomplished and influential figures in the field of petroleum engineering. Dr. Economides organized and helped establish new petroleum engineering departments at the University of Alaska and the University of Houston. In addition, she has actively worked to increase diverse membership within the National Academy of Engineering, advocating for women and underrepresented minorities in the field. She holds a PhD in petroleum engineering from Stanford University, a master's in math education and chemical engineering from the University of Kansas, and a bachelor's in mathematics from Rice University. Welcome to the show, Dr. Economides. Thank you for joining us on Energy Transition Talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction. Much appreciated.
So to start, could you tell us a little more about what drew you to study engineering, and what does the energy transition mean to you given your background in the engineering space?
Well, the decision to study engineering is interesting because that came after the Nixon administration started the Title IX legislation, and that actually opened the door for women in engineering. So my time in engineering goes back exactly to when that happened. And when I decided to study chemical engineering, it was on recommendation from someone who actually offered me a job, which was hard to come by at the time as well for women. And he said he knew I was interested in computer science, but there was no future there studying chemical engineering. So that's kind of amusing. So it's just really lucky that I did that and that I went on to Stanford University to study petroleum engineering because I've managed to have an amazing career with 20 years in Schlumberger, and now I'm reaching even more than 20 years in academia. So I've seen both the industry side and the academic side. Right now, petroleum engineers are confronted with the energy transition. And I find this enormously exciting, this energy transition. But today, the concerns about climate change lead to consideration of how can we migrate away from so much combustion of the fossil energy, the coal, oil, and natural gas, towards other ways to still have the lifestyle we've learned to enjoy. And I would like to think that the petroleum industry is going to be able to play a really important role in this transition, which I think amounts to away from combustion.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I guess to expand on that, what role would you say petroleum engineering plays in? I mean, you're talking today about hydrogen. So what role does petroleum engineering play in the development of hydrogen as an energy source and more broadly in the energy transition?
So hydrogen may be a critical direction for the petroleum industry. The least expensive way and also the most energy efficient way to generate hydrogen is from natural gas. And that is one of the fossil fuels that we produce along with crude oil. And if we go that direction as an industry, especially large companies that are vertically integrated, we can be covering finding natural gas, producing natural gas, generating hydrogen, transporting it in pipelines, bringing it to the public for use, and also to industrial location for their use. So much as the petroleum industry managed to transition the world away from reliance on horses for transportation to vehicles and to trains, we could be the major force in transitioning away from the combustible liquid fuels coming from crude oil to hydrogen for refueling. Hydrogen doesn't work for every application of crude oil refined fuels. In particular, it's harder to see how we make hydrogen work for shipping, ocean shipping, and air navigation. But never say never, even in those directions. But for land applications, I think it's pretty clear that hydrogen could work. So more recently, as we look at natural gas to hydrogen, what we have discovered is that it could be interesting to take hydrogen away from natural gas reservoirs instead of natural gas. So what am I saying? I'm saying you might locate facilities for steam methane reforming near your natural gas reservoir. And if you capture the CO2 from that operation right there, you can return it to the natural gas reservoir, the same reservoir. So now you don't have to find some other reservoir, some aquifer. You can simply put it back in the same reservoir where the methane came from. And it turns out that more often than not, probably you will actually improve how much methane you can recover from that reservoir. So this is a really interesting approach. And if you cover all the emissions from this operation, then you're producing what's called blue hydrogen, which is every bit as clean, if I may use the common nomenclature, as hydrogen we might get from electrolysis using electricity. And it's actually cleaner if we consider grid electricity, because our electric grid is far from green. We do have a rather significant percentage now of electricity coming from renewable resources. But yeah, like 20%. 80% is, well, we also have some power coming from nuclear power, and that's not emitting. But the rest of the 60% or more of our electricity is emitting CO2. It's combustion based. So blue hydrogen coming from natural gas is essentially net zero hydrogen, and hydrogen from electrolysis is not even close. So I can make a very strong case for this hydrogen idea on a lot of fronts.
I guess could you maybe explain, you mentioned the blue hydrogen, and one thing you hear a lot about, like you hear a lot about the different colors of hydrogen. There's gray and there's blue and there's green. So maybe could you explain the difference and help us unravel this whole color scheme for hydrogen?
So a significant portion of global hydrogen is generated 30 miles from where I sit, 30 to 50 miles. It's used in crude oil refining and petrochemicals around the Houston industrial or the Gulf Coast industrial area. This is what we call gray hydrogen. So if you generate hydrogen from methane, but you vent any of the carbon dioxide from that process, this is called gray hydrogen. California has refueling of transportation, road transportation vehicles, so personal vehicles, trucks, buses. The hydrogen dispensed in California, as far as I know, is mainly only gray. So what makes it blue? The hydrogen generation from methane becomes blue if you do capture the CO2 emissions from the process. Now, this also brings up another point, though. People, environmentalists, rightfully are concerned about methane emissions, methane itself. So I think it's correct. It's important for me to mention that blue hydrogen must not let any methane escape either. So all the things I'm describing, producing methane from a reservoir, making it into hydrogen, returning CO2, we can't allow any methane release. So as long as you are very, very careful about that, then you have a net zero hydrogen. So this is what's called blue. So what's called green is if you have electricity that is strictly either renewable or alternative. So alternative brings in nuclear. If your electricity source is strictly from non-combustion emission generation, electricity generation, then you can use electrolysis, which basically is breaking down the water molecule. You use electricity. You use a lot of energy to do this, but you break down the water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. So if you generate hydrogen this way, then it also is net zero. It has no greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not sure there are any actual instances of this anywhere, but we can describe how you would get there.
Thanks for that very helpful clarification. So it sounds like blue hydrogen is more net zero, where you're still maybe using fossil fuels to generate the electricity, but at the end you're capturing those CO2 emissions, versus green, you're using it completely from renewables, so renewable sources.
Yeah, if you can generate electricity that is strictly from renewable sources, then I think it's fair to call the hydrogen generation from electrolysis green. And just to clarify, for the steam methane reforming, you're not using electricity. You might, but you don't have to. That process does not require electricity. France would be a good place to look for this, though, because 75% or more of their electricity is from nuclear. So if they are electrolyzing water, they would probably come closer than most places I can think of could do. Another place it might be able to do this would be Iceland, because I think their power may be coming from geothermal. And actually, as I think about it, places like Washington State, that most of their electricity comes from hydroelectric, they could make green hydrogen. Likewise, Norway, their electricity is coming from hydroelectric. So I'll revise my view a little bit. Yes, it's possible, but wind and solar are not obvious how you get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are definitely a lot of potential opportunities here for hydrogen, and hydrogen is not a new source of energy, right? I mean, the first hydrogen fuel cell was developed in 1838 to generate electricity, and it was used as far back as the German airships in the 1930s. So I'm wondering, what are some of the applications for hydrogen as a source of energy? How is it primarily used today? You mentioned electric vehicles. Are there other processes or places where it's used a lot today?
So I'm not sure how many instances of this there are, but I think there are instances of this. But hydrogen is very good for steel making as an alternative to coke from coal. Much cleaner approach to steel making. So this is definitely on the table. Hydrogen is used to make fertilizer. Hydrogen can be used to supply industrial heat. So a lot of diesel uses that are not transportation oriented have to do with industrial heat. A lot of those could use hydrogen. It's not free. You have to change your process a bit, but you can do it. Electric power generation can use hydrogen. There's already interest in blending hydrogen with methane for power generation. And if it's blue hydrogen, that would decarbonize your power plant by mixing the net zero hydrogen with methane. And this can be done with little or no change in the power plant. So that is an activity for blended hydrogen and natural gas that is very much on the table. But your most efficient electricity generation using hydrogen would be fuel cell based. And I don't know that there are plants that are doing that. So that would be something for the future, but it's an interesting direction for hydrogen. And there are many others. So it really does interest me that we can reduce combustion a lot by going towards hydrogen. Now, anytime you do combust hydrogen, if your process goes to combusting hydrogen rather than fuel cell, then you're not just producing water vapor, but you will have nitrous oxides that come from combustion because there's nitrogen in the air. So that's important too. And people are kind of aware of this for power generation, that using nitrogen won't stop the nitrous oxides. Sorry, using hydrogen won't stop the nitrous oxides unless you go to the fuel cells. And then you don't have that issue.
Yeah, so could you just summarize the advantages and challenges of using hydrogen as an energy source?
Sure. So this brings me to an opportunity to come back to vehicles. So an advantage for hydrogen is really high efficiency. So for example, why you may be able to offer hydrogen for consumers in place of liquid fuels like gasoline and diesel is because the vehicles would be a different technology. They would not be using combustion. They would not be using internal combustion engines like what we use for gasoline and diesel. Instead, they would be using fuel cell electric vehicles. Fuel cell electric vehicles. So most people think electric vehicles is about battery electric vehicles like Teslas, right? But I've actually had a conversation with the head of technology in GM, and he told me that General Motors, who I think are on record saying that something like 2035, they will no longer produce any more vehicles that are using internal combustion engines. Everything will go to electric vehicles. So he clarified to me, yes, but for them, whether it's a battery electric vehicle or A fuel cell electric vehicle makes very little difference because they are constructing what they call a skateboard chassis. The car is built on top of the power system instead of around an engine like the cars and trucks we drive today. So they're fine with building vehicles, trucks, cars, buses, whatever they build, designed for hydrogen fuel cells or batteries. And what hydrogen fuel cell vehicles achieve is a way more efficient propulsion mechanism than the internal combustion engine. And so this is how hydrogen may make its way as a popular choice for electric vehicles. I've driven a Tesla for about 10 years. I currently am not driving one. And so I'm well acquainted with just how long it takes to recharge batteries. If you instead had a hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle, and there are dispensing stations where you can refuel, like there are in California, 5 minutes. So in 5 minutes, you can give yourself 300 or 400 miles of range that will take many hours of recharging on a battery, unless you have a supercharger. And even then, we're talking about half an hour and more. And that's if nobody's ahead of you in line. So fuel cell EVs might be something that American consumers would really, really like.
Yeah, that would be quite revolutionary.
And demonstrated in a way already in California. It's not very much adoption. Very few people are driving the vehicles, but I have spoken with one or two who have, and they really liked driving the hydrogen fuel cell. So those are advantages. You ask about disadvantages.
Yes.
So one more advantage, there are other colors of hydrogen. There are lots of ways to generate hydrogen. And so this offers a rich innovation front. And I don't want to necessarily go into the many details, but you can generate hydrogen from coal. You can definitely generate hydrogen from nuclear power plants. So hydrogen has high energy density per unit mass, but it has low energy density per unit volume unless we compress it. So this is a disadvantage. So if you drive a Mirai, you have filled your tank with hydrogen raised to a pressure of 10,000 psi. So that's what you have to do to be able to have enough energy in the hydrogen fuel. So this is a disadvantage because we don't have to compress liquid fuels. You just pump them into your gas tank and you don't have to compress them into the tank. So that's a disadvantage for hydrogen. It's also difficult to store and difficult to transport. So people have claimed that this is a reason why hydrogen will never be widely available. But the thing is, we are storing hydrogen in this 30 to 50 mile radius I mentioned before. And we are pipelining hydrogen, and it can be done. And not only that, but hydrogen could be distributed quite easily around the country with our own natural gas pipeline system if we blend it with the methane that's being used in those pipelines. And people are looking at ways to repurpose existing pipelines for pure hydrogen use as well. Now, that's not there yet. So the pipelines that are currently transporting hydrogen are dedicated to hydrogen, and they're designed for that. I'm not sure any of them were repurposed. I'm just mentioning possibilities, and part of why I like this space, because there are all sorts of ways that people might make this happen. Let's see. Well, it does require energy to produce hydrogen. I know of a hydrogen reservoir in Brazil. I've read about it, but this is really, really uncommon. So you can't just produce it out of the ground like you can natural gas or crude oil. So it does take energy to produce the hydrogen, but but the overall energy balance favors hydrogen, even though
Yeah.
you have to use energy to produce it.
Well, it sounds like hydrogen has a lot of potential to make a dent in, the energy transition space, especially since industries like steel making are not industries where you can easily use renewables, right, to fuel these processes. So I'm wondering how big of an impact on the energy transition and at a global scale do you think hydrogen has the potential to make in 2022?
Well, it's just, you've asked me questions about what could be potential applications for hydrogen. And there really are many. There really, really are many applications. So that's why I get really excited about some of the companies. I know Chevron is working on hydrogen processes. I don't know exactly the details of what they think they're going to supply hydrogen for, but I know they're working on it. Shell as well, and I'm sure the other major companies, Exxon, are looking at these prospects. And I think if we really do try to replace combustion uses with hydrogen, this is enormous, enormous. Transportation alone is 30% of the CO2 emissions in the United States. So if transportation is migrating away from combusting liquid fuels, this will have a major impact.
Definitely. And if we can use energy storage as well, that would be even better. Jim, I think you had a question about energy storage.
Yeah, and again, thank you, Christine. It seems like hydrogen is an old idea. Hydrogen as an energy source is an old idea that's now becoming a new idea, right? That's kind of come back around, and people are taking a serious look at it. You mentioned that maybe storage and transmission is a potential problem because the hydrogen molecule can leak through the current infrastructure, but it can be used by the current infrastructure. I just read recently that you talk about Chevron. They recently purchased a big share of something called ACES, or the Advanced Clean Energy Source in Delta, Utah. So my question is, how? I mean, it seems like this new interest in hydrogen is starting to to get some momentum behind it. And how much are the maybe the tax incentives provided by the U.S. government's infrastructure program? How is it giving a boost to people who are thinking seriously about much bigger use for hydrogen?
So a specific instance I've looked at is this hydrogen refueling for transportation. In the Houston area, it would appear that you can profitably supply hydrogen for refueling. And I'm looking at the whole picture, even without government help. So I think the door is open for the industry to do what Rockefeller did and come up with attractive options that provide us with affordable access to a new fuel, which would be hydrogen. It's not new, you're right, but I mean, the technologies that are making this possible are relatively new. And I will say this as well. I remember back to the time of the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, when they were talking hydrogen economy and freedom car. Remember all this? If you look at diagrams of where they expected to get hydrogen from, you will not find fossil anything on those diagrams. So it wouldn't be surprising if petroleum industry wasn't very supportive of that. But the ideas that I'm describing could make very good use of what the petroleum industry has excelled in all along, as we have been and continue to provide abundant, affordable, reliable energy. If we could make that happen with hydrogen and profitably, then we wouldn't all be working for the government in the future.
So I clearly can see the advantages that it's a similar business model. We can reuse the infrastructure, the skill sets of the engineers, both chemical, petroleum, etc., are already there. They just have to, it's a slight shift versus a wind and solar, which would be very significant shift for a petroleum company.
Seems to me. Seems to me. But government incentives may make it way more profitable to go after wind and solar. But this I will say, it's already profitable without the incentives to supply hydrogen refueling in the greater Houston area. That might not be true all over the country, but I think it's true here. But if you go to blue hydrogen, you make enormous money potentially because of current government incentives, tax credit incentives.
One thing that we haven't talked about a whole lot, that we know that with wind and solar becoming a larger part of the grid infrastructure, and maybe even in some cases replacing baseload of nuclear plants being shut down in California specifically and others, there's a need for a storage mechanism. And of course, everybody's talking about batteries right now. What about hydrogen as a storage mechanism for these intermittent utility grids?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in this direction. And it brings up another need for petroleum engineering skill set, potentially, because most of the hydrogen that's stored near where I sit is stored underground. It's stored in salt cavities, and most of these are probably manufactured. So, what you can do if you have subsurface salt is circulate fresh water in it, dissolve the salt out, and that leaves a cavity. And so, those cavities are where we currently store most hydrogen. You can store it on the surface, but this brings up the risk you were alluding to earlier, that hydrogen gets through steel pressure vessels. And so underground storage is very much of interest. So something else that we've looked at in our research is whether we might be able to repurpose natural gas storage facilities in the country for storing hydrogen. And the vast majority of those, I think, are, they're not salt. Salt is a dozen or so. If you look at natural gas storage. So there is some natural gas storage in salt caverns also. But the vast majority are depleted hydrocarbon, and my guess is depleted natural gas. So the question is, can we store hydrogen in pore space? There have been some demonstrations of storing hydrogen even in aquifers with, I would say, limited success. It doesn't look like the optimal choice to me. But the idea of storing hydrogen in natural gas reservoirs, that looks really, really interesting. I don't know if you can, I don't know if there's going to be a purity issue because natural gas was there first. How are you forever going to have tainted hydrogen that's gone into that sort of pore space storage? I don't know the answer to that. That's part of what we want to research, actually, to understand better how that might work. But in the near term, there already are legitimate uses for blended hydrogen and methane storage. So a transition of using existing natural gas storage facilities could start with marketing blended natural gas and hydrogen. So again, I just can't find enough places to look. They're out there everywhere I look. Interesting things to investigate regarding hydrogen.
Sure. So as we near the end of our conversation, is there anything you would like our audience to remember about hydrogen as an energy source? And what do you hope the energy industry will do moving forward? Do you think there's any way we as the public can get involved?
The main thing that I would emphasize is that it really does look interesting. Hydrogen looks like a very, very interesting direction for the petroleum industry. I guess I might rather that they are spending more resources towards hydrogen supply, but to the extent that they are making those choices for profitability reasons, in other words, because governments make it more attractive to do wind and solar than to support hydrogen directions. So it is a tough problem. Our American industry is market based. It is the quintessential market based industry, and they owe it to their shareholders to spend money in the most profitable way. But I'd like to think that hydrogen may start to be more and more profitable as a direction. I hope so.
Thank you very much, Dr. Economides. It's been a very interesting discussion on maybe a topic that we have put down the list of options, with wind and solar being, promoted so strongly. But it's clearly one that we shouldn't forget. And I want to thank you for helping us to understand this topic.
Hydrogen is the most abundant element found in the universe, and producing hydrogen as a source of energy is not a new technology. But producing enough hydrogen at the scale needed for the energy transition is not an easy task.
However, hydrogen can contribute to the energy transition in many forms. Although hydrogen is colorless, we've described the different forms of hydrogen in many different kinds of ways. There's green hydrogen from electrolysis of water. There's blue hydrogen of steam reforming of fossil fuels, which is the most common way of producing hydrogen today. There's pink or purple hydrogen produced by electrolysis using nuclear power. There's brown or black hydrogen using coal as an input, and white hydrogen as a byproduct of industrial processes, or in rare situations, actually produced from the earth. The uses of hydrogen are limited only by our imagination and maybe by a few engineering and economic concerns.
And transporting hydrogen or using it in fuel cells for transportation or energy storage are very promising applications that we may want to pay attention to in the future. The energy transition is up to the changes that we are willing to make as individuals and as a society. So until next time, we hope you learned a little more about the story of the energy transition, because the energy transition is up to you and me.
We would like to thank the USC Ershagi Center for Energy Transition, which aims to develop innovations in energy technologies and foster the transition to a low-carbon future, for sponsoring this podcast. Special thanks also to our guests for today, and Abby, our technical guru, for their important contributions to our podcast. Thank you so much for tuning into Energy Transition Talk. We would really appreciate it if you could leave a rating and review, and make sure to subscribe to our podcast so you can automatically get access to our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Justine.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Paulina, signing off from Energy Transition Talk. Stay tuned for the next episode.